Welcome back to activity 1.2.7. We're building a wing out of a plot file, and we're going to 3D print this bad boy and then put it into our wind tunnel, do some testing. So when we left off, we imported the curve. I've got curve number 1 over here in my tree, and you'll notice there's curve 1. Now when I put it in, I put it on the Z0 plane. So this is kind of important. As you look down here in the lower left corner, you'll notice that by putting it in the Z0 as all of my points, I am now in the plane formed by Z0 and then XY. So I'm essentially in the front plane on this. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and start a new sketch. So I select my sketch tab and my sketch button. Now let me try that again here. So let me get out of that plane because I didn't want to be in that plane. So I just messed that up. I'm going to come back out here. Don't select the curve. So I'm going to go sketch, and now I want to choose my front plane. You should rotate to be 90 degrees to the plane, and you're going to notice that my curve here has an open end on it. And it's not really in the sketch. There's nothing in the sketch. So to bring that curve in, what I like to do is just select the curve, it highlights it, and then do convert entities. Immediately comes in as a black line, and my curve is underdefined by the nature of the way it was brought in, but you'll also notice that it's not closed. It's all white behind here, and if it closes, it would be gray. So sometimes it's a little tricky to find where it's not closed. Typically, though, look at the leading edge, and you'll see all those points form a continuous curve. And I'm going to then look over here at the trailing side of it and zoom in. Let me just be sure I'm looking straight at it. And you'll see it's not closed. Now, we don't need to go crazy on making this a perfectly smooth closure, but what I'm going to do is use a tangent arc up here, and I'm just going to drop it on the upper edge and draw it down to the lower edge and let it be. And that's close enough. This is a tiny little arc. So now your profile may or may not be fully defined. It's not important if it isn't perfectly defined. What's important, though, is that it's a closed body and it's grayed out with a closed body. Once I've got that done, I want to exit my sketch. From this sketch, I want to extrude it. So remember I said about 4 inches. Let's go 100 millimeters. It's about 3.9 inches, 3.94, I believe. So I'm going to go ahead and choose to extrude using sketch 1 as the basis for my body. I'm going to choose 100 millimeters as the depth, and I'll go mid-plane. That way I have a line of symmetry in the middle, which will be useful later on. That looks good. Let me go ahead and accept that. So now I've got my basic wing shape. Now this is good, but there's a little bit of a problem with this. And the problem is I measure AOA, or angle of attack, based upon the chord angle to the relative wind. Well, I don't have a good judge for what the chord angle is. I can kind of eyeball it, but I want to put a better measure of my chord angle. So I'm going to go ahead and start a sketch on this and draw in my chord line. So let's start a sketch tab, sketch button, choose the left hand side of your wing so that it faces out when you mount it. I'll then choose a center line, and I pretty much want to go from the midpoint here of this leading edge, and I'll choose that. Sometimes the origin is the midpoint, not always, to the midpoint of the trailing edge, and this is approximate. Doesn't need to be perfect. So there I've got a good chord line. Now the problem with that chord line is I can't see it when I 3D print it. So I'm going to put something in that allows me to see it. To do that, what I'll do up here is I'm going to go ahead and choose a rectangle, but I want to use a 3-point corner rectangle because I want the rectangle to end up parallel to my reference line, my chord line. So I'll just go ahead and start with my standard 3 clicks. So the first click drops the edge, the second click pulls out an axis, and I'll get it close to it. The third click stretches it out, and I don't really care the size right now. Now I want to do a property that exists between one side of this rectangle, so I select it, hold down my control key, select my chord line. And let's go ahead and make this parallel. So now my chord line is parallel. The next thing I want to do is I want to put this thing somewhere where I can actually print it and see the whole thing. So it doesn't need to be big. It just needs big enough for me to see it when I set the wing up, to eyeball its levelness. So I'm going to go ahead and move this whole thing. I'm going to drag it back this way. And then drag it up. And I'm going to get it more towards the middle of the airfoil because there's a little more room here. So I'm just fiddling with it, and I don't really care about the size of it. But I'm going to give it a couple of dimensions here just to keep it stable once I put it in place. So we'll call this, let me call that 12 or 10. That's fine. 10 millimeters is about ½ inch long. You know what? Let's go 15. We'll go a little longer. The height here, probably going to be a couple millimeters. Oh, it isn't even a couple millimeters, huh? It's 1 millimeter. Let's go there. Wow, that is going to be one small line. And then I'm going to give it a distance back from the leading edge from my origin. And I'll make that, let's go 28 back. And then let's also put a distance from the bottom up to it. Let's go 5.75. Now your measurements are going to vary based upon what you have on your drawing. Not super important. All I'm really trying to do is to get this so it's not moving around, so it's relatively stable. One of the things I didn't do is I didn't stabilize this line. So I'm going to go ahead and give that a dimension also. And actually, you know what? I'm going to go from this being my leading edge. It'll be close enough. Grab that bad boy and bring it down here. Put it right on there. There we go. All right, looks pretty good. Let me go 5 now. 5.5. Now this is a skinny little wing. And we'll go 0.5. There, I've got my angle of attack indication. I also need to put my name somewhere on it. And I'm just going to put my initial, and I'll just put TS on it. And I'm going to have to make this font smaller. So I'm going to go ahead and choose a font that's smaller than 3 millimeters. I'm going to go with 2 millimeters. It's going to be really hard to see. And accept that. But we're just going to print it just barely on this leading edge. So I'll just click and drag this to where I want it to go. Maybe I will. There we go. Just fiddle with it a little bit. That looks pretty good. Close enough. Okay, I've got those two entities done. I want to exit my sketch now. And what I'm going to do, even if it's underdefined, don't worry too much about it. Your wing shape is fine. I'm going to go ahead and cut this, and I'm going to cut it to about 2 or 3 millimeters. I'll say 3 millimeters deep. And all that I did when I cut that, let's see if it gives me any errors. Doesn't look like it did. All that I did now is I just created that little indent, and what that's going to do is give me a way to mount it in the wind tunnel and test it. And then this TS is going to just let me see whose wing it is. So I've got my wing done. It looks pretty darn good. The middle of this wing is where we're going to actually put the mount, and what we'll do is we'll measure that after the wing's already made. So we don't have to worry about putting a marking there. So let's go ahead and save this. So I'm going to save it as my name, and I will call this Teacher Wing 1. And now the next thing I want to do, I'll submit that part file because this allows me to open up your part and be sure it will work right and it's sized right. The next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to save it also so I can 3D print it later. This time I'm going to give it the same name, but I'm going to make it a .stl file. And we'll learn more about that in our next module, about how we 3D print them. It asks me how many triangles, and just go yes. You may get asked whether it should include all bodies, and the answer there would be yes. And that just means you've got something disjointed a little bit in the print. Now I've saved my .stl file, and if I go back out and look at my file locations, and I come here into my airfoil, you'll notice I've got my construction instructions downloaded. I've got my .stl file, and I've got my solid part. If I click on this .stl, Windows opens up a default viewer here, and I select it in OK. And what you can see here is there's my default file. Not very useful for us. We'll use a different folder when we go ahead and run this for real. So there's your part. So just as a reminder, what you're going to actually submit is you're going to submit the solid part, and that in this instance was this .sldprt, and you're going to save the .stl for us to print later. And you've got your wing done. That's all there is to it. Answer the conclusion questions and submit this. Thank you very much. Hope this helped. Take care.